Welcome back to Coaching with the Bible. This is episode 84, season 2, episode number 30. We are in the midst of the holiday of Passover. Pesach is upon us. Today is the 6th day of the holiday. Tomorrow, the 7th day, and the day after is, again, Shabbat, the Sabbath day. So we are recording here on a Thursday, a little bit early for us on a regular weekly basis, but nonetheless a good time to jump into a quick topic, actually related not to the weekly reading, but related to the holiday itself. The 7th day of the holiday of Passover traditionally is held to be the day that the people of Israel crossed the sea in the book of Exodus. And so they leave on the first day of Passover, and by the time they reach the sea, by the time they reach the water, 6 days have passed, and now they're standing at that location. So I wanted to share a thought here about a topic that relates directly into that story, which admittedly is not so obviously coachable, which is miracles. Miracles are a really interesting topic, and people attach themselves and connect to the concept of miracles in different ways. Obviously, the Bible is replete with examples of miracles, and history is full of stories about people who have experienced miraculous events around them. And people look at miracles and think about them in a lot of different ways. Some people are naturally sort of attached to the language of miracle because perhaps they have maybe a deeper sense of religious belief, or belief in a higher being and a higher power. And so miracles attached that way, whereas, let's say, the rationalist or the scientist or the person of reason and logic, let's say, not that those are, necessarily completely distinguishable and mutually exclusive, would try to attach something to some sort of a natural or physical explanation, something that's happening in the world, some sort of phenomenon that's happening in the physical world. So I may have said this before, but I'll say it again here. To my mind, no one at the sea on that day in the story of the Exodus had any idea what was about to happen, other than God. And this is not that today's, coaching with the Bible is necessarily fully and wholly religious focus, but let's sort of dive in a little bit on that story for just a second. Again, the people have escaped. It's already been an incredible story. The last year of their existence in Egypt has also been rather miraculous, for lack of a better term. All the plagues and everything that's happening, the idea that they can leave at all, the idea that Pharaoh would actually chase them out, that any of that stuff would happen is hard to explain in rational terms. As I mentioned last week, it has become the call to arms or the inspiration and motivation of many a movement, many a people around the world towards their own desires for liberation and freedom and anything of redemption, anything of that nature. And so it's a story for mankind. But the matter of the story is not simply that it was a war and a rebellion of the people against the kingdom, and they fought a quote-unquote natural war and then left after defeating the enemy. Everything happens in this supernatural God manner, right? God intervening in history is sort of how we understand a lot of what's happening in the Bible, even if, as there have been over the course of time, people who have tried to explain away all of the plagues in rational scientific terms, earthquakes and comets and all kinds of other things that have happened at the time that brought about all the different plagues and have tried to remake them. I'm not sure that it's necessary to sort of have one versus the other, but in the context of what we're trying to think about, let's think about those moments standing at the sea. The situation is bleak. The people have left Egypt. They've escaped. They have their freedom, or so it appears. And now that they stand against the waters on one side and Pharaoh and his army of Egyptian soldiers on the other side, what is left to do? And so the natural approach would be to think that they're doomed and that the only course of action is to turn around and fight. That makes sense, right? That would be how it would go down. The idea that the sea would split and the people would walk through and that they would be protected by clouds and fire and by God, and that the enemy would perish there in the waters, I would imagine even Hollywood would struggle to come up with as an approach. But that's what happens, right? That is what happens. So, how do we get there, and how do we think about that, and what do we do with that, and what do we do with the concept of miracles in life in general, and in terms of what we want to accomplish in life, and how do we think about those kinds of things? So, I think a lot of people normally, as I said earlier, would attach something miraculous to some sort of natural occurrence that they can't explain. So they don't know all the physics, and they don't know all the biology, and all the chemistry, and all the science, and whatever it is. They don't know all of Newton's laws, and they don't know all the other laws of the universe. Effectively, people don't know what's necessarily natural, and therefore, they assume a level of understanding of nature, and anything that sort of goes outside of nature is something that's supernatural. It's a phenomenon, but again, in the religious context, it would be something that we would call a miracle. And so you have a balance of natural versus supernatural, explainable versus unexplainable, things like that. The reality of it is, when you talk to people in science and you talk to people who, say, experience miracles in their lives, there would seem to me that the line between what is natural and what is supernatural is very thin. And that the things that we take for granted as typical physical occurrences in the world and things that aren't, we don't really know. So take, for example, the possibility that if the sea splits and no one's there to see it, right? It's a proverbial idea of the tree falling in the forest. So did a miracle occur if nobody was there? So there's an additional element then to the miraculous, which is probably timing, or the experiential aspect of it, of the person that's there, and not just the physical phenomenon that's happening in the sea or the air or wherever it is. And so miracles are not just simply some sort of a physical phenomenon, but they're also requiring timing, presence of a person who has the ability to determine and decide whether something is miraculous or something is not miraculous, something is supernatural, something is natural, something is explainable, something is unexplainable. So it requires multiple elements to make it something miraculous. To make it something real, a miracle of the spiritual nature, then it requires some level of belief and faith, or the question of belief and faith, as it is the case in the Bible, or as it comes down in a lot of the midrashic exegetical literature about what's going on inside the camp of the people. You have some people who are real believers, and they believe that something is going to happen that's going to save them and rescue them at that moment. You have some people who are really skeptical about what's going to happen, and they're going to perish and they're going to die. And you have some people who are in the middle. And then the action that's taken sort of reflects all those different things. People complaining, people yelling and screaming, people saying to Moses that they're going to die. And then again, the midrashic literature that tells us that Nachshon, who is the leader of the tribe of Judah, jumps into the water and then the water splits. Or a different idea that comes up is that the people start to inch into the water, and then once they start to inch into the water to the point where they can no longer take it or manage it on their own, that is when the water splits. And so the question sort of that comes out from the coaching with the Bible perspective of it is, it's not simply just the spiritual aspect of it and the religious aspect of it, which is definitely part of it here, but it's also the approach that we take to maybe this part of it, which is, what does it take for a miracle to then occur? Is there something sort of incumbent upon us? Or can we turn the language of miracle to a different term? We call it chance, we call it luck, some might call it opportunity. So if a person ends up in the lane of miracle, they step into the lane of miracle, and so now they're at that nexus point where they're standing and they've done their part, and now the miracle sort of washes over them. So then the miracle hit them and it worked. At the same time as a person who doesn't step into that lane, and the miracle sort of just goes right past them, they might have sniffed it or felt it, but they didn't necessarily experience it, and then it's gone. And so perhaps the aspect of miracle that we want to attach to, again, language I think is key here. If we want to call it luck, I think some people might call it luck. But when we think about luck, and we'll spend more time on luck in the future because I think it's a super important subject. If you're a podcast person, then you've listened to maybe to Guy Raz in his podcast on how I built this. So his final question to every one of the entrepreneurs, how much do they ascribe to luck and how much do they ascribe to hard work? I think is a really interesting question. And other people will simply just say that luck is hard work, just a different terminology. But in the context of what we're looking at here in terms of miracle or luck, is the notion that those things require some level of action, minimally, to actually have those occur. The people are required to do something. They are required to step into the water. They are required to walk across the water. They are required to have a high level of belief and faith in the desert itself, at the sea splitting event itself. But in general in life, to assume that miracles are just going to happen to us is a hard thing to assume. To operate under the impression that if I do and I act and I work and I do my part, that there's a chance that something might happen on the other end of that, that's something that I think a lot of people actually ascribe to. I'm going to do my part and let sort of, call it fate, call it luck, call it chance, call it reality, call it opportunity, sort of show itself and shower itself upon me, call it blessing, some people would, shower itself upon me so that I can then have the experience or reach the success and goals that I want. That it's not just hard work and it's never just sort of miracle and luck, but it is some mix of the two that gets a person to the space where they can then say, oh, a miracle happened to me. And so that's really what we're looking at here, is this notion of miracle versus luck, the miraculous in life, things that are happening. They're probably the same thing. Natural occurrences, in fact, on a day-to-day basis are in fact miraculous when we stop and think about them. Things that occur day-to-day that we take for granted, that we assume is natural, are in fact unfathomable when we start to break them down to their essence. And so we have to sort of begin to appreciate miracles and miraculous things in different ways. There are things that are unexplainable. There are illnesses that occur to a person that then go away, whereas to someone else, God forbid, it causes them to lose their life. Situations of people who grow up the same, it appears to grow up the same. One person ends up massively successful, and one person, unfortunately, is massively unsuccessful. We'll call it miracle. We'll call it chance. We'll call it luck. We'll call it a lot of things that are unexplainable in the world. But my sense is that with respect to coaching with the Bible, and the idea that, and when we're talking with coaching, is the notion that when we start to believe and ascribe in the idea that there are some things that happen in the world that we cannot explain, and some things that require of us to do something to get into a space where the unexplainable happen to us, where we move into a different lane or a different tunnel and a different channel so we can sort of, lift our own lives. So then we're tapping into something much deeper. There's the famous quote from David Ben Gurion, and I'll end with a quick story from an experience of mine with a project. Ben Gurion is the first prime minister of the state of Israel, is famous for saying that in Israel, in order to be a realist, you must believe in miracles. There's this notion that with our people, that over the course of the millennia, miraculous things have happened to us. As much as we've suffered in a lot of places and a lot of times, we believe in the idea that miracles do happen, that things will happen ultimately that are beyond our control, that will be hard to explain, that we'll certainly appreciate, but we'll only get there by virtue of the fact that we have done our hard work. And here's that last story, which I think really ascribes to a lot of what we're talking about here today in Coaching with the Bible. I was working on a project a few years ago. It was a synagogue project here in Israel. It was a community it was a capital project. They were trying to build their building after many, many years. And so when we finally got together and it was time to sort of run the campaign, and I had to get up and speak to this group and sort of try to inspire and motivate them that this was going to work and that they should actually believe that this was actually going to happen, I told them that they had to put rationality aside to some degree and to appreciate that everything that they were already was miraculous and unexplainable and impossible as a phenomenon. Because 99% of that community had come together from other places in the world. They'd all moved from other places in the world. They all moved to the same location in a period of a number of years, had started the community. They had a leader who also grew up somewhere else in the world, who also happened, quote unquote, to move to that community. And together, over the course of time, built a really beautiful center of religious and spiritual life. To assume that that is going to happen normally is a mistake. And so once you're already operating in the space that everything that's happened to that point is unexplainable and difficult and, phenomenal and all these other things, so then you can operate in the space that building a building for $1.5 million when you have no money to start with is totally normal. Because the balance of what one looks at with respect to what's miraculous and what is not miraculous, what is natural and what is supernatural, has shifted. The line that I described earlier that is ever so thin grows even thinner once it is that you can appreciate that none of it is a given and much of it is quite miraculous, no matter what the term is that you use for it, miracle, luck, or otherwise. And so as we look at life and we sort of lean into this period of time here on the seventh day of the holiday, a day of miracles. It's not that the other stuff isn't miracles. It's all miracles. It's all miraculous. It's all beyond explanation. It's all phenomenal. It's all supernatural. It's all of those unexplainable things. We can appreciate that it is upon us on some level to lean into some of the supernatural, to lean into some of the phenomenal, and to allow the opportunities, and that's the term I'll ultimately leave with, allow those opportunities, you'll call it luck, I'll call it opportunity, to wash over us by virtue of the fact that we did just like the people in the desert did. We took the first step into the water and let the rest of it happen for us. That is Coaching with the Bible for this week. See you next week.